There are people we never met, but somehow they became part of our lives. Through living rooms, old television sets, quiet evenings we barely remember, except for the faces that stayed with us. Welcome to Hollywood Tribute, where we honor the actors, voices, and moments that time was never able to erase. And if tonight's story brings back a memory you thought was gone, share it below. Someone else may remember too. Jill Curzon has passed away at the age of 87, a name many younger generations may not immediately recognize, but for those who remember British television and films from the 1960s, her face belonged to a very particular era, a quieter era. Black and white screens in living rooms, families watching together because there were only a few channels, and somehow that was enough. Reports confirmed her passing in Spain, closing the life of an actress whose career moved through a period when British entertainment was changing fast, trying to define itself between post-war tradition and the new cultural energy of the 1960s. Jill Curzon appeared in productions that reflected that world. Before celebrity culture became relentless. Before every actor carried their private life into headlines. There was mystery then. Distance. I always think performers from her generation carried something different. Discipline, perhaps. Or the understanding that success could disappear as quickly as it arrived. She worked during years when British television was becoming part of everyday family life, when audiences formed attachments not through social media, but through repeated evenings spent in front of the same familiar faces. That leaves a different kind of memory. And time keeps doing what it does. One by one, the people who stood inside those decades quietly leave. Not always the biggest stars, sometimes the ones woven into the background of an era, which may be why their absence feels strange. Because losing someone like Jill Curzon is also a reminder that the world she belonged to, the voices, the pacing, the atmosphere of those years, continues to fade a little more, even while many still carry it intact in memory. David Lynch has died at 78. For many people, that sentence feels strange to read because David Lynch never seemed to belong entirely to ordinary time in the first place. He existed somewhere between memory and dream, between fear and beauty. A filmmaker, yes, but also something harder to explain. His family confirmed his passing, ending the life of a man who changed American cinema without ever trying to fit comfortably inside it. Older audiences remember when films still surprised people, when directors had signatures. You knew a movie by the feeling it left behind. And Lynch, he built entire worlds out of silence, strange conversations, empty highways, red curtains, sometimes confusion, sometimes terror. When Twin Peaks arrived in 1990, television shifted. Millions sat in living rooms asking the same question week after week. Who killed Laura Palmer? It became more than a mystery. It was culture. Then there was Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, The Elephant Man. Stories that refused to explain themselves completely. I think many viewers admired him because he trusted people to sit with uncertainty. That's rare. He painted, made music, talked about meditation for years before most celebrities openly discussed inner life. He seemed genuinely interested in what existed underneath noise and ambition. Not everyone understood David Lynch. Maybe that was never the goal. The strange thing about losing artists like him is realizing they weren't only creating films. They were shaping how generations learned to see ordinary things differently. A lamp in a dark room, a quiet street at night. The feeling that something hidden was waiting beneath everyday life. And now, another unmistakable voice from the late 20th century becomes memory itself. Donald Gibb has died at 71, and for many who grew up in the 1980s, His face arrives before his name does. Big frame, loud presence. The kind of actor who could walk into a scene and instantly become unforgettable. His passing was confirmed, closing the chapter on a performer audiences remember from a very specific era of movies, when comedies felt rougher around the edges and cult classics were built in late-night television reruns. For millions, he was Ogre in Revenge of the Nerds. Wild, intimidating, oddly lovable beneath all the chaos. That character stayed alive long after the credits stopped rolling because people from that generation remember quoting those films with friends. College comedies became part of the culture. Others remember him differently. As Ray Jackson in Bloodsport, standing beside Jean-Claude Van Damme in one of the martial arts films that practically lived inside VHS collections across America during the late 1980s. Back when renting a movie for the weekend actually meant something. Donald Gibb carried a physical presence that made him easy to cast as the tough guy. But actors like him often end up representing something softer over time. Nostalgia. Familiarity. I think that surprises people. The intimidating characters become reminders of youth. He wasn't always the headline star, and maybe those losses hit differently. Because supporting actors often traveled through our lives quietly, appearing again and again in films tied to specific memories, years, even people we watched with who may no longer be here. Time keeps moving. The faces from old VHS covers, cable reruns, and crowded video store shelves slowly disappear. Then one day you realize you're not only mourning an actor like Donald Gibb, you're mourning the version of life that existed when you first watched him. Gene Hackman has died at 95, and it feels difficult to place that loss into ordinary words because actors like him didn't simply appear in films. They occupied entire eras. His passing was confirmed after a life that stretched across some of the most memorable decades in American cinema, leaving behind performances that many older viewers can still picture instantly without needing the title. The voice, the stare, the feeling that he was never pretending to be tough. He simply was. For people who lived through the 1970s and 1980s, Gene Hackman belonged to a generation of actors who changed Hollywood. The French Connection. That Oscar-winning role as Popeye Doyle arrived in 1971 and carried a rawness audiences weren't used to. Then Superman, where he made Lex Luthor clever and strangely entertaining. Unforgiven. Hoosiers. Decades of work. He won awards. Yes, 2 Academy Awards among them. But awards rarely explain why someone stays in memory for 50 years. What stayed was his presence. There was something unusual about Hackman. He often played men carrying frustration, pride, stubbornness, sometimes regret. Human flaws. Maybe that's why people believed him. He stepped away from acting quietly years ago, choosing distance from Hollywood instead of chasing attention. I always respected that. Not everyone knows how to leave, and perhaps that feels especially moving now. Because when someone like Gene Hackman disappears, it reminds us how many voices from the America of old movie theaters, Sunday evening television, and rented VHS tapes have slowly gone silent. The films remain. They always do. But the people who made us believe those stories were real. Little by little, they become part of history too. Before America knew her as the girl in pink, before teenagers taped her photos onto bedroom walls, there was a little girl in California growing up in a house where music never seemed far away. Not pop music, jazz. Her father was blind, a jazz pianist, and when people talk about childhood, they often imagine certainty, stability. But creative homes can be beautiful and unpredictable at the same time. Molly Ringwald learned early that applause and loneliness sometimes live in the same room. She started performing as a child, singing before most children understand embarrassment, acting before many know who they are. By 5 years old, she was already on stage, not because fame was calling, because performance felt normal, almost like breathing. And maybe that changes a person. Maybe when your identity forms under lights, you spend years wondering who you are once the lights disappear. Then came the 1980s. America was changing. Teen movies were changing. Suddenly, there was this red-haired girl who didn't look unreachable. She looked thoughtful, awkward sometimes, smart, emotional, real. By 1984, 16 Candles arrived. Then, The Breakfast Club in 1985. Then Pretty in Pink in 1986. 3 films, a few years. Enough to freeze someone forever in the minds of millions. But becoming the face of a generation has a hidden cost. People stop seeing you age. They stop imagining your fears. You become a memory they revisit, instead of a person still living. Years later, Molly admitted the famous Brat Pack label never felt flattering. She believed it reduced the serious work they were trying to do. Imagine carrying a nickname created by strangers for decades. That's another kind of burden. Not tragedy. Something quieter. Being permanently remembered at 17 while trying to survive 50. And underneath all that fame, a woman was still forming, still uncertain, still becoming someone beyond the movies older women now remember with tears, smiles, or both. Because life had more chapters waiting. And some would ask her to begin again. There's something people rarely talk about when remembering famous women from the 1980s. The way the world freezes them. You stay 20, forever, while your real life keeps moving. After Pretty in Pink in 1986 and The Breakfast Club before it, Molly Ringwald had become more than an actress. She was a symbol, maybe even an emotional safe place for teenagers who felt awkward, overlooked, different. And symbols don't get permission to grow older easily. By the late 1980s, something had shifted. The movies changed. Hollywood changed. The sweet uncertainty audiences loved in young women was suddenly replaced by something harsher. New faces. New trends. That happens more often to actresses than actors. People celebrate your youth, then quietly ask where you went. Molly made choices many didn't expect. She stepped away. Not dramatically. Not with bitterness. Just movement. Toward Europe. Toward France. Toward another language and another life. She eventually married French writer Valérie Lamenière in 1999. The marriage ended only a few years later. Divorce arrived in 2002. Divorce after reinvention carries its own sadness. Because sometimes you're not only losing a person, you lose the version of yourself you hoped would finally feel settled. People who watched her in the 80s probably never imagined Molly Ringwald sitting with ordinary disappointments, failed relationships, questions, regret. But celebrities age into those things too. Then came motherhood, later than she once expected. Her daughter arrived when Molly was 36, after years of hearing what she described as a biological clock becoming almost impossible to ignore. Eventually, twins followed. Motherhood changed the rhythm. Fame stopped being the center. Children became the center. And there's something quietly brave about women who survive being adored by millions, then choose ordinary tenderness instead. Packing lunches, worrying, waiting for calls, loving. Years passed. The girl who represented teenage uncertainty became a woman carrying memories, marriages, children, unfinished dreams. maybe stronger, maybe softer, probably both. Because reinvention rarely arrives once. Sometimes life asks for it again and again, and another unexpected chapter was still waiting. One that would force her to reconsider what the world thought it knew about the young actress everyone believed they understood. There comes a point in some women's lives when they realize something uncomfortable. People love who you were, not always who you are becoming. For Molly Ringwald, that may have happened more than once. Because decades after The Breakfast Club, audiences still asked about lockers, high school crushes, and the Brat Pack, as if time had stopped in 1985. But her own life hadn't stopped. Not at all. Children grew. Her body changed. Priorities changed. The strange thing about motherhood after fame is this. Your children don't care who adored you in theaters 40 years ago. They care if you listen, if you're home, if you understand. Molly once admitted mothering sits above everything else she has done, above acting, writing, music. That says something about a woman who spent years being recognized everywhere. And then something else happened. Age arrived publicly. Women in Hollywood know this story. The camera that once worshipped youth begins looking elsewhere. But Molly did something unusual. She kept changing, writing books, translating French literature, returning to jazz, the music of childhood, almost like returning home emotionally. People imagine reinvention feels exciting. Sometimes it's grief, because every reinvention asks you to bury an older version of yourself. Then came another uncomfortable honesty. Years later, Molly reflected that parts of The Breakfast Club had not aged well, not because she rejected her past, but because growing older sometimes means seeing old stories differently. That takes courage, especially when your career depends on nostalgia. Many stars protect old myths. She questioned them. And maybe that explains why she avoided diving deeply into some reunions and documentaries centered on the Brat Pack years. Looking backward forever wasn't where she wanted to live. There's sadness in that. Also, freedom. Because eventually, a person grows tired of introducing herself using versions of herself from 40 years ago. The red-haired teenager disappeared long ago. The woman remained, more complicated, more thoughtful. A mother, writer, translator, singer. Someone still working, still changing, still carrying memories millions share with her, even if those memories no longer define her. And perhaps the most surprising chapter wasn't fame, or Paris, or motherhood. It was learning how to age without apologizing. The strange thing about getting older is that one day you realize the people who once watched you are aging too. The girls who saw Pretty in Pink in theaters. The women who copied the hairstyle. Who believed awkward girls might still be chosen. Many of them are grandmothers now. And Molly Ringwald is no longer carrying only her own history. She carries theirs too. That's heavier than fame. Because nostalgia sounds warm from a distance, but up close, nostalgia often means loss. Lost parents. Lost youth. Lost versions of ourselves. Years after becoming the face of teenage uncertainty, Molly built something quieter. Marriage again. 3 children. Writing. Translation. Jazz. Not as an escape, more like a return. A circle closing back toward childhood, toward the music her blind father once played around the house. She has described jazz as the place she returns to when she wants to feel grounded. Her father, Bob Ringwald, died in 2021. Parents leave. Eventually they do, even for famous daughters. And perhaps grief changes people in ways cameras never capture. Maybe that is why some women become softer, others become sharper. Most become both. Molly once said, one of the hardest things about motherhood was realizing her time was no longer fully hers. Imagine hearing that from someone millions once believed had everything. Because ordinary sacrifices arrived after extraordinary fame. School schedules, worry, late-night calls, watching children become adults. Her oldest daughter is now grown. Pursuing acting, too. Though Molly once resisted that path for her children, wanting them to have something closer to an ordinary life, and here she is now. Not frozen in 1985, still working, still writing, still appearing, still becoming. That may be the part of her story people underestimate. Survival. Not dramatic survival. The quieter version. Remaining curious after being worshipped young. Remaining open after disappointment. Remaining yourself while everyone remembers another version. So if women over 60 still look at Molly Ringwald and remember who they were, perhaps she offers something else now. Permission. Permission to age without disappearing. To change identities more than once. To leave old photographs behind and continue anyway. Because her story never became a farewell. Only a longer road. And somewhere tonight, the girl from the movies is still moving forward. Demond Wilson has died at 79, and for many Americans who grew up in the 1970s, that news carries something heavier than simple recognition. Because Sanford and Son wasn't just another television show. It lived in homes, week after week. Familiar voices, familiar arguments, laughter that became routine. His passing was confirmed, marking the loss of the actor millions knew as Lamont Sanford, the patient, frustrated son trying to keep up with his father's chaos while somehow holding the family together. People remember Sanford and Son because it reflected something real beneath the comedy. Working-class struggle, family tension, affection hidden inside arguments. The series became one of the defining sitcoms of its time after debuting in the early 1970s, and Lamont was at the center of it. Demond Wilson had timing that looked effortless, which usually means it wasn't effortless at all. Later came other acting roles, writing, and eventually a very different path in life, moving toward faith and ministry. That surprises some people. Others understand. Time changes what matters. I think actors from classic television occupy a unique place. Unlike movie stars who appeared every few years, sitcom actors entered homes constantly. They became part of ordinary evenings, dinner trays in front of the television, parents watching, children nearby. That creates attachment. And maybe that's why losses like this feel personal, even decades later. Because when someone like Demond Wilson leaves, people don't only remember the actor, they remember the years around him. The furniture in old living rooms, the sound of network television, the relatives who laughed at the same scenes and may no longer be here. Another familiar face from America's television past becomes memory. The episodes remain. The laughter, too, just carried by fewer people each year. Tom Noonan has died at 74, and for many film lovers, his passing feels different from losing a conventional Hollywood star. He wasn't the actor who always stood in the center of the poster. He was often the presence you remembered afterward, the unsettling face, the quiet intensity, the character who lingered. His death was confirmed, closing the life of an actor whose career stretched through decades of American cinema and television, often in roles others might not have wanted. Strange men, damaged men, frightening men. People who watched Manhunter in the 1980s remember Francis Dollarhide. Not loud. Worse than loud. Controlled. That performance stayed with audiences because Tom Noonan understood something many actors never do. Fear often comes from silence. Then there was The Monster Squad, where he gave unexpected humanity to Frankenstein. RoboCop 2, Heat, Last Action Hero. Different eras, different audiences. Somehow, he fit into all of them. I think actors like Noonan become more appreciated over time because they weren't chasing celebrity in the usual sense. They built careers through atmosphere, presence. He also wrote, directed, created. That matters. The strange thing about getting older is realizing how many recognizable faces from the films of the 1980s and 1990s slowly disappear. Not always the household names first. Sometimes the actors who shaped entire moods inside movies. And those losses can catch people off guard, because you remember watching Heat late at night, or stumbling across an old thriller on cable television years ago. Suddenly, those memories return before the person's name does. Tom Noonan belonged to that world of cinema, where imperfections remained visible and unusual actors still found space to become unforgettable. Another face from those years is gone now. The performances stay, quietly waiting in old films, unchanged, while everyone who watched them keeps moving through time.